So firstly, thank you all for making time to join us. Secondly, we would like to apologize. The first apology is for starting late. We've had some last minute team swaps that have had to be made. So we've just spent the last few minutes trying to figure out how best we can do that. And then the second apology is most of you would only have received the invite for this webinar yesterday. We apologize once again for that. As you can imagine, with the end of the year, all the organizations involved have a million sort of meetings and reports and things to do. So we would want to apologize for that. And I would want to let everyone know that um, if your colleagues or contacts weren't able to make it for today's meeting, there will be a similar webinar tomorrow. The structure will be exactly the same, the agenda exactly the same. So if there is someone you know that would have wanted to join us today but couldn't make it, please do inform them that there's a repeat of this webinar tomorrow. In addition to that, this session is being recorded. We'll record today's session as well as tomorrow's session. And the idea is we will sort of take highlights from both days and just produce a very short sort of edited version of these webinars so that people that weren't able to make it today and tomorrow still have an opportunity to listen in and provide their feedback. So I believe I was sharing my screen. Let me just make sure that's happening again. So in terms of how we see the next 90 minutes unfolding, there's going to be some flexibility. As I said, some of our team members are currently unavailable, but in terms of how we hope the hour and a half will proceed is we're first going to hear from Sekotlane from NEH, and they will provide a context setting in terms of where we are as South Africa, where we are as Africa, and where we are as the global South as it relates to the G20, the C20, and the work that the different tracks within the G20 do. After hearing from Jenny, we're going to hear, sorry, after hearing from Sekotlane, we'll move on to updates in terms of what has happened since October. So just to provide some context, some of the organizations involved in organizing this call hosted a kickoff workshop in October in Johannesburg. That was an in-person workshop. And the thinking behind that workshop was mainly just to provide information to civil society within South Africa, the continent, and beyond in terms of what the G20 is, what the opportunities are, and how perhaps we could start organizing around those opportunities. So we're going to hear an update in terms of what has happened since that workshop. And then we're going to hear from Jenny in terms of the so-called outside track. We have that in quotation marks within the agenda because it's for lack of a better way of putting it. And after hearing from Jenny on the outside track, we will hear from Mandla, who is based at EJN, and Mandla will speak about the inside track, which is synonymous with the C20. After hearing from Mandla, we will move on to results from an expression of interest form, which has been open for, I think, over a month. And then after hearing what the results have been, we will hear once again from Mandla in terms of possible next steps. And I do need to emphasize that these are possible next steps. And where we see the value in this webinar isn't so much in sort of us blasting you with lots of information. We see the value in the Q&A session, where the idea really is that, once we've provided you with a snapshot of what the information looks like, we would love to hear your responses in terms of how do we move forward, who does what, when do they do it, and so on. So we really want to try and set aside as much time as possible for the Q&A. So I would ask the speakers to just be cognizant of that. I know I've given most of you sort of 5 and 10 minute slots, but if you can keep it to less than those 5 or 10 minute slots, that would be great. So yeah, I think without any further delays, I'm going to hand over to Sekotlane, and they will just provide us with the context. Thanks, Sekotlane.
Thanks so much, Tatenda. And hi, everyone. So good to see all of you here today. We're really excited to have you here to also just share what has been happening behind the scenes since we were convened together just over a month ago. My role today is just really to just give a brief overview of the state of the world and what we're up against as we build the C20 platform and begin engaging with the G20 platform overall. So the world today faces an unprecedented confluence of crises that demand urgent and coordinated action. As civil society, our engagement with the G20 must really center on the critical issues exacerbating global inequalities, which threaten our shared humanity and jeopardize our planet's future. We are living in an absurd reality where the wealthiest 10% command over 50% of global income, while the poorest half struggles with a mere 8%. This glaring disparity is not only morally indefensible, but also economically destabilizing, especially for us here in the majority world. Austerity measures driven by sovereign debt crises compound this inequality by stripping communities and people of essential social protections. The G20 must prioritize policies that reverse austerity and bolster investments in multidimensional poverty reduction. Sovereign debt crises, particularly in the majority world, have hindered nations' ability to respond to the twin emergencies of climate change on one hand and social inequity on the other. Countries like Zambia and Kenya bear the burden of unsustainable debt, leaving them unable to finance climate adaptation or sustain social safety nets. Of course, these are not the only exemplary countries of this crisis. We can see this awash all across the majority world. We must advocate for G20 support to restructure sovereign debt equitably, enabling nations to channel resources into climate resilience, health, and education. The era of unchecked tax evasion and illicit financial flows must also end. Domestic resource mobilization through progressive taxation has become all the more critical for national development. However, this requires global tax cooperation to ensure multinational corporations and super wealthy elites pay their fair share. The G20 must lead efforts to create a fairer international tax system, closing loopholes that perpetuate inequality. Development financing institutions must also evolve to meet the scale of today's crises. The G20 should champion reforms within multilateral development banks and vertical funds to prioritize sustainable development, address systemic risks, and support the global South in achieving economic and climate justice. These are not only for their own sake, but to fundamentally safeguard the basics, our access to energy, bread, and water in the day-to-day. This work is really for global health inequality and relieving women and girls of the gendered burden of care and availability to violence. It is for dismantling the oppressive economic structures triggered by half a millennium of European colonial conquest, extraction, and exploitation that persist into the present day. In launching South Africa's presidency of the G20 platform on Tuesday, the president reminded us of what the G20 is. One, it is a platform that comprises the world's largest developing and developed economies, accounting for about 85% of global GDP and 75% of international trade. Two, it was established to tackle pressing global economic and financial issues, and giving the grouping's command of the world economy therefore plays a critical role in influencing global policymaking and fostering global economic solidarity, stability, and sustainability. The G20 represents a unique platform where the wealthiest and most influential nations can take decisive action for providing global economic stability, shared growth, and access to the world economy, but most significantly, assuring us of the social protection that we need in an equitable manner across the world. As civil society, we must demand bold commitments to solidarity, equality, and sustainability. We must remind the G20 leaders that their decisions must reflect the collective aspirations of humanity, prioritizing the most vulnerable and ensuring a future where no one is left behind. Through our engagements with the G20 process, being civil society, we also have to be realistic about our ability to influence it. We must remember that this is a government-to-government platform, and engagement platforms, such as they are, tend to be used and instrumentalized more for politics and optics. And so ours is not so much to steer the center of the G20's government-to-government platform, even though we will fight to do so. Not even the South African government by itself has the power to do so. And we know that much of the ambitions we may share and have been building with the Global South member nations and economic blocs and civil society across them in this first 20-year cycle of the G20 platform is likely to be hollowed out. Worse yet, the next nation in the Troika will be the United States of America under the Trump administration. And then that will be followed by Argentina under the Malay administration in 2028. Both have already given us an indication of what is at risk if we allow the rising red tide of nationalism and white supremacist patriarchal repression that serves the prevailing economic elites of the world to wash over the world for generations to come. This is all the more reason why this moment demands for us to build a C20 platform that is inclusive and global in character, a platform that is collaborative and is committed to continuing the progressive agenda that has been led by our predecessors. And most importantly, we must build a C20 platform that is not only transparent in both how it is formed as well as how it works, but one that is principled in being guided by a commitment to human rights, gender equality, and racial justice. The time for incremental change has passed. The time for transformative action is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sekutlane. I think it was quite sobering the way you presented the information to say there is a set of massive opportunities, but we need to be realistic in terms of our power, our influence, and how we strategize as civil society, and how we organize ourselves in that strategizing. So thank you so much for that scene setting. So I'm going to hand over to Jenny, who is with the Fighting Inequality Alliance, and she will kick us off in terms of updates on what has happened since that workshop in October. Yeah, so over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Tatenda, and morning, everyone. Really, really nice to see so many of you here. Friends from the Joburg workshop and more who are joining, and many more we need to engage and plan with over the months ahead. I will just add, since the Joburg workshop, obviously one of the big things that has happened is Brazil's G20 summit, right, in Rio, that happened last month in November. A number of us who are based in South Africa were there. And the range of, as well as the summit itself, of course, the range of civil society activities that we can learn from as we strategize for the South African presidency and how we organize amongst South African civil society, but with international allies and friends too. There's some lessons for us to learn from the Brazilian experience. So I'll reflect very briefly, because I see the slot is extremely short, on two of the big pieces, and then hand over to Nkateko for the other two. So As Fight Inequality Alliance, we're more engaged in what you would call the outsider spaces. So one of those pieces, there's a long tradition around G20 summits and other international multilateral fora to hold people's summits as a counterpoint, a counterweight to the official discourse, and provide a space for people to construct their own demands, their own alternative systems based on their lived experience, the experiences within their movements. Brazil, of course, has a very rich and long tradition of social movements, unionism, very, very vibrant civil society. So as you would expect, they took up the mantle of holding a people's summit. There was a couple of things to note about it. It was a year-long process of different movements, indigenous groups, feminist movements, the Black movements, the trade union formations, many others inside different marginalized identities inside Brazil, organizing together. It was a year-long process to bring that summit together. It was a few of us coming from South Africa attended. It was a beautiful day, a mixture of cultural sharing, a mixture of panel events, plenary sessions, a sort of that full experience that you find in a summit where people are coming together, particularly from across a different country. And they had been working on a declaration together for that whole year. So there was a sharing of that declaration and a kind of celebration of the strength of the movements, the political education work that had gone on across their movements over the year. And it was a beautiful, uplifting day to be a part of. And they very much expect South Africa to continue that tradition of holding a People's Summit as South Africa hosts the G20 as an important piece of that outsider strategy to give voice and to give space to those radical demands and alternatives. It was a beautiful day to be part of. Bridging quickly into the G20 social, President Lula introduced a new initiative for his G20. You will all know his political history as coming from the union movement, extremely close to the social movements in Brazil, wants to be seen as a president of the people. He introduced a new element to the G20 summit, an official space called the G20 social. And that in itself caused a rupture within the movements and the unions in civil society, where some decided to participate in the G20 social at the request of President Lula, who didn't want such a strong vocal outsider voice in the context of far right fascism and so on in Brazil. He wanted a more united front, so to say. That caused, as you can imagine, big political discourses. All the movements had been organizing within the People's Summit process. That then split. A number of the major unions and movements moved into the G20 social space and held a series of panel events, cultural activities, music, and their own declaration in there. So there's a political tension there, depending on the South African government's plans as to whether they continue that G20 social process. It will be something for us to debate and to watch very closely, the impact that had on the effectiveness of the outsider interventions. There's a specific context, obviously, with Brazil, the relationship that Lula has with the movements and the unions in Brazil is probably a unique one at this point. There aren't many other leaders who have it right now. And South Africa's context is, of course, different. But nonetheless, for me, it was a huge lesson to watch that play out. The other outsider element was obviously a march ahead of the summit as well, which was unfortunately during very heavy rains in Rio. But nonetheless, there were those vibrant outsider elements and organizations choosing to do a whole myriad of other activities, cultural work, panel sessions, different types of engagements under their own organizational banners. Nkateko, I'll hand over to you for the other elements to reflect on.
Great, thank you, Jenny. And just want to start off by saying it's lovely to see a lot of people here in the space, which signals a continued commitment to really participate in the G20 process, but as well as understand really how we could leverage the moment to deliver on socioeconomic outcomes. So my part is really to speak about the C20 itself, having been engaged in the process as well, and seeing where it has come has been truly encouraging. And just to explain, just by brief background, given our short time, is that the Civil 20 became an official engagement group of the G20 in 2013. And over the years, it has moved from strength to strength, has grown in terms of participation, and has really held and played multiple roles, really by coordinating civil society to ensure that, governments are held accountable to the kind of commitments that they're doing during the engagements. But the most important part about the C20 is that it's really underpinned by principles, and it's a space that fosters wider engagement by civil society in order to influence the outcomes of what would understand as the formal process around the G20. And so these principles provide a general framework that really gives the background of how we foster collaborative work, but also strengthen our engagement as civil society in a very principled way to influence the outcomes of the G20 negotiations. And so these principles include establishing a global character. That means that the C20 as an engagement platform is a global space for civil society organizations from the world over, and understanding that the G20 moves from country to country, but it's also ensuring that, when it gets to a country, it also envisages or encompasses the ambitions and policy stances from civil society at all levels. So this is a space for building consensus, building solidarity on the common issues that affect us as nations. The second principle speaks to transparency. In all its work in terms of the drafting of policy positions, its C20 pronouncements, or the decisions that are made, the idea is to ensure that everybody is brought into the fold, that information is shared transparently, regardless of, the leadership structure that exists, but to ensure that everybody is brought along into the process, but also to enhance participation, given that the process is transparent, it's inclusive, it's participatory, to ensure that organizations are all contributing to the policy pack. While we understand that the C20 itself is composed of a leadership structure, it's important that that leadership structure also gives room to the participation of the working groups, to the voices of the community's constituents who are participating in those, but feeds into a broader a structure that allows for a consensus around key priorities. The third principle looks at independence. While we welcome, inputs from the different working groups, from recognizing that the C20 works in a structure that includes other stakeholders, it's also ensuring that this input lands in a space that is open for debate, that the ultimate decision-making and sign-offs from the C20 position encompasses the voices of everybody and has less influence of, stakeholders such as the government, if we may say, but also any other membership states. So the idea is to really maintain that independent civic voice that can really call out government and hold them accountable. The fourth principle looks at collaboration, facilitating engagements across the different engagement groups, here I want to emphasize that the Civil 20 is but one engagement group. There are many others that encompass the Labor 20, Business 20, Think Tank 20, Women's 20, Youth 20, among others. So it's important for us to also recognize that the C20 can be seen as a platform that brings together those voices and those policy asks from engagement groups, but it's important that it doesn't work in isolation of the other engagement groups as well. So collaboration is key. Principle number 5 looks at human rights, gender equality, and women empowerment, putting at the center of its work, the importance of ensuring that we don't perpetuate any inequalities, that we allow for inclusive participation, but at the same time, safeguard human rights and call out those violations on human rights and gender equality as we see them. So this space becomes a space that really promotes and advances sustainable development goals in its policy asks, of the collaboration and inclusivity that happens. Principle number 6 looks at inclusiveness, which I have echoed. So in the composition of working groups, in the composition of the leadership structure, we have to be cognizant of ensuring that the C20 remains a space for meaningful engagement, cross-country collaboration, and also is non-tolerant of any forms of discrimination. So that is, we make sure that the C20 has to include and be cognizant of the inclusion of various geographies, take into context gender identity, sexual orientation, race, caste, language, age, ability, legal status, ideology, religion, or political beliefs in how we compose of these working groups, as well as its leadership structure as well. And this is also in line with various instruments that also ensure that the C20 is in line with, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, among others as well. Principle number 7 looks at continuity. So how do we ensure that in its operation, while the G20 moves from country to country, there is a responsibility in terms of ensuring that each C20 process should always build on its predecessors and ensure that the voices and experiences of the different parts of the world are considered as it moves into each geographies. There are some great lessons that we should take on as civil society as well, primarily lessons from India, wherein the C20 structure itself was announced by the government, which means it compromised some of the principles that I have outlined here before. So this framework poses as a guideline for C20 structures moving forward and into the next cycle in terms of how we protect the space, how we ensure that it brings in voices of communities. The last principle looks at predictability. To contribute to the transparency of the C20 itself, it's very essential that we have clear schedules, that process is understood by participants, and that makes the role of the C20 Secretariat very important in ensuring that no one is left behind, that communication is done in advance. People know exactly what the G20 calendar looks like, both at a formal process, but also bringing together the voices in the C20 to align to the process in order for clear deadlines and milestones to be established. So that in and of itself speaks to some of the guiding principles of the C20, to hold it as a structure that has integrity, that has voice, that sits outside of influence from governments, but really brings together the kind of issues and demands from communities. Now, what does this mean for a C20 structure? For me to wrap up, is the C20 is composed of a troika, and this troika essentially is a structure that allows for dialogue and coordination between the leading civil society organizations from the current, previous, and following C20 or G20 hosts. And so This allows for the continuity that I spoke about in my previous iterations around the principles. And so what composes the leadership of the C20? The C20 is composed of a chair, a Sherpa, and a sous Sherpa who then form the Troika. And those are supported by the C20 Secretariat, whose responsibility is primarily administrative, financial, logistical coordination, ensuring that those who are participating in the process are handled and cared for, and also have the information that they need to participate meaningfully through the process. This is underpinned by the International Advisory Committee, which is composed of international civil society organizations with experience working in the G20 over time, but also whose main role is in an advisory capacity to the steering committee. The steering committee of the C20 itself functions as an executive body responsible for ensuring that the C20 remains an open and diverse process and facilitates a broad range of views from across civil society. I mentioned earlier that while it's a national process, we should be cognizant of the fact that given that it's in South Africa, we have the African Union joining as a +1 member, we have to be drawing in on the voices at the national context, regional context, as well as at the international level. So this, by way of composition, reflects, the structure of the C20 leadership, but also the principles that underpin the C20 as well. Where are we in terms of the outcomes of the Brazil process? Is that we had the C20 structure in Brazil who worked on, a series of engagements to bring civil society together, but also got together on 10 key working groups that in consultation and within building consensus, arrived at the 10 thematic areas. And that means that for the South Africa process, the South African civil society would then need to collectively come together to understand what are the gains from C20 in Brazil, how can we then self-define what those working groups mean for us to be able as civil society within this presidency take forward some of the key demands. My last point is around, recent engagements, given that we have been doing some preparatory work, my colleagues, Jenny and others have mentioned this before, was really to start coordinating around, understanding what the G20 process means for us, but also bringing together civil society to now start self-defining how we could engage meaningfully in this process. And one of the engagements that have come through last week was an invitation from DIRCO, who is the Ministry of International Relations and Corporations, and currently the G20 presidency, who convened the sector or asked for a convening with the sector. While I recognize that these conversations are critical for fostering that relation, because there's a C20 structure that is meant to work in tandem with the formal G20 presidency, we are also mindful of the limitations that may arise with this, particularly on, inclusivity, who is in the room, how we ensure that a broad range of voices are also brought along as we engage with governments. And so we have been thinking long and hard. We've also raised our concerns in terms of the nature in which these spaces may be shrunk, particularly given that the meeting only invited a few number of organizations. So really championing, unlocking the space, championing allowing for different platforms to engage civil society, including hybrid formats. And so this meeting really was an inception meeting where the ministry itself was almost giving civil society a view of their priorities, which really center on inclusive growth, fostering industrialization, employment, advancing development in a way that addresses inequality. They also highlighted how they would focus on food security as a means of addressing our challenges in the region, as well as the importance of AI and digital governance or data governance, but really how these can be integrated in value chains in a more equitable way. So these are top lines South African government asks that we need to be confronting in terms of how we are establishing our working groups in a way that they speak and align to the formal negotiations process, because as civil society, recognizing that we have both inside a track, which is the C20 and policy process, we also have to make accommodations for ensuring that the outsider track comes in as well with the kind of demands that are speaking to the negotiations as we see them. So there's a lot of information at hand, and my colleagues and ourselves are in the process of really pulling together information and popular education material to really unpack what this process means, ensuring that we bring everybody along into the process. I'll stop there and thank you, colleagues.
Thanks so much, Nkateko, for that. I think you've done a great job of sort of painting the picture in quite vivid terms. It's a lot of information to comprehend, but I think you've done a great job of sort of encapsulating the core ideas. I'm going to hand over to Jenny from Fighting Inequality Alliance, who's going to speak on the so-called outsider track, which is one of the ways in which we as civil society can mobilize to get our leaders to listen. So over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Tatenda. I think only two short things for me to do here. Sort of give a sense of the kinds of activities that would typically or potentially take place as part of the outsider track. Where, as we said, the purpose is the need to have that autonomous space as civil society, as movements, as organizations. There are the official tracks, the C20 and other engagement platforms, but we know that, the shift in power that we're looking for, a strong outsider space and approach is also needed. For example, we know that the South African government at this point doesn't really intend to do very much concretely to take forward the Brazilian agenda on taxing the rich. We know that without a strong outsider push, upping the political pressure, the ante on that, we know that not much is going to happen. The same is possibly true of the debt agenda, which will be a critical piece as this is the first African presidency of the G20. We know those things, and to articulate the broader alternatives and critiques that need airtime, that need power built behind them. So the kinds of activities that you might typically see, and each country can, of course, define. This isn't some kind of rigid template that has to be cut and paste from country to country. But typically what you would see is along the lines that the Brazilians did, a large people's summit. And ideally that can be very large. One of the things the Brazilian comrades said to me, reflected to us in thinking about the experience they'd been on the last year and the difficulties they'd had with Lula's creation of the G20 social and the political divides that caused, is they said they regretted not organizing the People's Summit with an internationalist perspective from the beginning. They reflected that they had been spending their time, their energies debating and organizing as Brazilian movements amongst Brazilian movements and negotiating the difficulties there. And they had only towards the end started to open out the thinking and the planning to the international comrades and allies who would wanted to be involved, either attending, contributing, etc. So a very large, vibrant people's summit that generates lots of power within movements and our broader communities is going to be critical, and connects this as an internationalist piece. A South African hosted but internationalist piece is going to be really important and powerful. Equally, a political education program. You can't just have people arriving around a G20 summit and not really having done the groundwork. For many people, this is an entirely new conversation, locating your struggles, your experiences in this global economic context that Sikwatlani outlined at the beginning. It requires a political education process. Of course it does. And that needs to begin, and as the Brazilians did, and other countries before, in India, Indonesia, that requires a long process, especially if you're wanting to come up with declarations, common demands, etc. Political education, big piece. And another piece is going to be the street protest and those sorts of tactics that visibly show the people power, visibly give space and voice to the headline demands, messages that people want to create together. So typically there will always be a street march. That may also not just be in November when texts of communiques, the political substance of what the G20 will say is locked down. That pressure might also need to be created earlier in the year when some of the key political decisions are being made. So those three pieces are very typical. And then, as I said, there tends to be a wide range of other things that organizations will choose to do around that time. Film screenings, panel debates, cultural evenings, things in communities, radio sessions, a whole suite of activity around this massive international show, being in your country, being in your city. There will typically be an enormous amount of activity that speaks to different organizations, constituencies, and agendas. So it's a very, there's typically 1,000 things to do around a G20 summit, but we want to make sure there's some of those big collective focal points where we cut through in a more concerted way into the media and the social media and the political debate around that time. Just briefly, in terms of next steps, I would say my suggestion is that the process for the C20 is much more tricky. It's very formalized. We'll come on to that. I will let other colleagues who are in that space kind of map out that discussion with you now. In terms of the outsider space, it's a coalition of the willing, as always with these things. And what I would suggest is we have in the expression of interest form that's been open for a while and will continue to be open to you all and to others who are not on the call or were not in the workshop. We'll continue to open up that space, and I'm happy for us to play a role in convening a first meeting of interested folks. Some of you indicated in the form you were interested in the mobilization elements. So everyone who's interested, we can come together in a meeting and start to map out consensus on the way forward, the types of things we want to do, the kind of agenda, how we want to work together, the usual things. We can map that out early next year, and the process will remain open for others to come in. It's not a closed shop. If a movement doesn't hear about the expression of interest form, that's not the end of the conversation, but we can commit to kicking off a process for the outsider work in January when people return after the end of year break. So I think that's it for the outsider stuff for now, and I will hand over to the next person for C20.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Jenny. I love the fact that you gave very practical examples of what this outsider track looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to be protest. It can be film screenings, cultural debates, sort of radio sessions in local languages. And I think as civil society, we often sort of box ourselves into sort of 50-page research reports, 20-page policy briefs. And sometimes we do forget our constituencies. We forget that they're listened to. We forget that there are young people that have a massive appetite for debates and so on. So thanks so much for those examples. So we are a bit behind time, so I'm just going to slightly rejig the agenda. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the EOI form, which Jenny has made reference to. And then I'm going to ask Mandla to talk about the sort of insider track. So Jenny's made reference to this EOI form, and I can see Sikotlane has shared this form within the chat. I'm just going to sort of focus on two things. The first is up until now, we've got over 420 responses. It's important to note that these responses are not just South African. We've had people from Asia, from South America, from Europe, all indicating interest within the C20, which I think links to the fact that it's an international process that we as South Africa are very lucky to be hosting over the next 12 months. And you can see from the screen, I hope everyone can see it shared, that in terms of responses, there is a lot of appetite for people to be actively involved in the public mobilization and education thematic area. And that's the so-called outsider track. You'll see that the numbers don't add up. And that's because, we didn't want to box people to say you can only be inside track or only outside track. So there were quite a lot of organizations that said they want to be involved on the public mobilization side as well as the formal side of things. In terms of who these organizations are, we tried to come up with 10 categories. They were imperfect categories. And I think, as Nkateko said, those categories will then be sort of eventually transformed into working groups by the people that take this forward. But you can see that I think a lot of responses came from education. And I think education in this instance was covering a whole range of things. So it's not education in the sort of typical sense of, schools and colleges, but it's civil society organizations that have an interest in building the capacity of citizens, building the capacities of decision makers, and similar entities. Another big group which came out was from the climate and environmental justice sort of theme. And another strong showing was from the health side. So it's nice to see this plurality of sectors represented, especially because the C20 has typically or historically been an economic space. But it's nice to see that, we've got health putting their hands up, we've got climate putting their hands up, we've got education putting their hands up, we've got marginalized and vulnerable populations putting their hands up. So as Jenny said, the form is going to remain open. And the idea is we are just holding the space. And I think once the sort of leadership of the C20 within South Africa is finalized, once there's consensus on that, then we would then obviously hand over this database, and then the organizations that take the C20 forward would be able to start organizing, start contacting, and so on. So I've hinted at next steps. I'm going to hand over to Mandla, who is with the EJN, and he's just going to speak to us about what the C20 could look like. So yeah, over to you, Mandla.
Right, good. Yes, it's still morning. Good morning, friends. As you have heard from colleagues, what we have ahead of us is both an exciting time for South Africa and in general, Africa as well. But the steps to get us there are going to be quite rigorous, and it's going to need a lot of collaboration and unity among us all. You heard about the C20 principles. The C20 principles were reached because there've been quite a lot of confusion among civil society in different countries that host the G20 or that are members of the G20. And I think the principles came out of a need to articulate the best way that civil society can be a part of the G20 discussions and to therefore take part in what we are calling the inside track. According to the C20 principles and to the practice, it is up to the host country to decide how civil society is going to perform, how it's going to create a structure, a structure that is going to bring together civil society. So the C20, as we've heard from colleagues, is an official engagement group. It's an official space. That means it's recognized by the members of the G20. The difference now is South Africa is hosting the G20 at a time when other African countries have been brought into the space through the AU. So it means that this is a G20 with a difference. It's a G20 that brings also the continent as a whole. So we are hosting not just countries from G20 member states, but we are host to the continent as well, which means as civil society, we are going to mirror exactly what will be happening in the G20. We are going to be hosting civil society organizations from the G20 member states, as well as civil society organizations from the African continent. And I think, as my colleague pointed out, the principles tell us about the golden rules, transparency, independence, and so forth. I think there's only ever been one country where a government has decided how civil society is going to participate, and that was Saudi Arabia, which puts a pall on the the democratic space and the civic space that is available to civil society. So we know that the working groups are going to be the most active part of our association. We shouldn't perhaps just concentrate on the leadership. Of course, the leadership is going to be very important in coordinating how the working groups and the thematic spaces are used and how civil society interacts with the G20 space. So each working group will be coordinated by 2 or more organizations, one international and one local, with relevant experience and or expertise on the subjects debated. So you've seen the thematic areas that came out in the expression of interest, which are going to indicate what kind of thematic areas we are going to be taking forward as civil society. I think the most important thing to realize out of this is that there needs to be collaboration between all the civil society organizations that are interested. This is not a popularity test. This is not to say which organization is more popular. The leadership by consensus is also very important because it means as a country we should show maturity by being able to rally ourselves to a point where we can reach consensus about how we are going to divide up the different tasks. There are lots of tasks that are going to come out of this exercise. And the best way to make sure that we have a happy outcome is how well we share these tasks. There's a lot of work. There's probably more than 200 types of meetings that we are going to have in the different thematic working groups between now and when we finally host the G20. So we need to be very careful. We need to be cautious about how we decide on our leadership. One of the reasons why we keep debating the issue of who will lead us is in that in some countries they have umbrella organizations. And I think South Africa, we used to at some stage have Sangoko, which was the umbrella organization of non-governmental organizations. We don't have such a structure. And only in those countries that have such a structure, it has been easy to transfer the responsibility of leading civil society in such events. So in our situation, it is consensus that will lead us to that point. I was going to dwell a lot on the principles and what it means and how they process has gone in other countries. But I think because in the interest of time, I should just say that the next steps that we are going to take are going to be determined by this meeting. We're going to debate today and tomorrow. How do we feel about how do we handle the many organizations or those organizations who have put up their hands? Do we say each one should go and separately create a concept note which talks to the context, which talks to the capabilities and capacities in how to lead us? Or should we still try and reach consensus based on some of the things that we've agreed on? I think we are almost 90% on agreeing on how this should go. There are those organizations that have put up their hands and that have taken up the space and have created all sorts of resources for us and have tried to lead as best as they can in showing what this is all about. What is the C20? What is the G20? How do we as South Africans use this space? How do we accommodate other civil society organizations from different countries? So in the interest of everyone, we want to build consensus. We do not want to have this decided for us by government, because that will ultimately put us in the same category as Saudi Arabia and other countries where governments have a rather stiff hand in deciding civic space. So I think the next session, and Tatenda will guide us in this, will try to determine how do we move from this point where we are almost ready, where the government has already received the baton from Brazil, and where we should be now starting to plan on the thematic issues that we're going to be working on, and where we should be creating a secretariat that is going to do most of the heavy lifting, and where our leadership is going to be interacting between civil society and government, and where we should be getting ready after that to be handing over to the next country, which is the United States. So how do we move from here where we are? What are the alternative models that we can come up with? So yeah, thank you. I think I'll hand back to you, Tatenda.
Thanks so much for that, Mandla. So I'm projecting a slide with 3 questions, which I hope capture what you'd want us to reflect on. So firstly, how do we build consensus? Secondly, who's putting their hands up and what are they putting their hand up for? And the third is, when would we want these steps to be done by? So yeah, we really would want this next 30 minutes to be sort of open conversation. We love criticism, especially when it's constructive. And even more than our love for constructive criticism, we really appreciate sort of solutions-oriented suggestions. So I see Aviwe Funani has had their hand up. I'm going to ask them to unmute and speak. And if anyone else would want to, I think, pose a question or provide a potential solution, please also put your hand up. And if you're not able to talk, then we would ask that you type in your solution or your question within the text. So Aviwe, if you're comfortable, may you please unmute and share with the group.
Yeah, thank you so much, Penda, and to everyone that was at the C20 launch last week at Circle. So just on what Mandla spoke about with regards to, I forgot to mention my organization. It's United for Global Mental Health. We focus on mental health policy, working with the UN agencies. So I just want to go back to Mandla's point with regards to, we'll be leading in terms of national and also international input or leadership roles. When we're speaking about that international roles, are we talking about the African Union member states, or are we talking international that's involving previous G20 countries? I just want to get clarity on that. But then the second part is just to say, have we started to think about impact measurement? Because I think, especially in the policy world, we just want to like say we're making change, but have we actually thought about how we will measure the impact holding up to next year, December, when the commitments and the declarations are made?
Cool. Aviva, thanks so much for, I think, just sort of throwing us back. So what I'm going to ask is if we can take a batch of questions and then perhaps people that want to respond may do so. So the current order is, and I apologize for the mispronunciations, there's Jyotsna Mohan from Forus, if they can speak, and after them, we could hear from Brenda Madumise and Hilaire Messi Pukam. Apologies once again about the mispronunciations. But let's hear from Forrest, please.
Thank you, Tatenda, for this great webinar, and thank you all the speakers. So it's really nice to know how you are moving forward, what you have taken. So my first and very simple question was, is there any deadline for the EOI? Because as you might have understood that many of us just saw it today. So and it's really nice to see that you have taken. So second thing I wanted to ask, the thematic, the 10 thematic, which is part of the EOI. So are these the potential working groups, or you have already decided on this? And the third thing I was like wondering really about, I have I was hearing a lot on civil society summit, or so I hope that this is clear that the G20 social is different thing, but the civil summit, the C20 summit is a different, the people summit is a different thing. So I think we have to be clear about it, and I think there's a clarity, but still the civil 20 has to be a civil 20 and not the mix of the G20 social. So that's something I had my own apprehensions, and so I think this is very important at this point of time to because it's a very much any G20 or C20 is a nationally led process. So, and we have seen even in India or even in Brazil. So how it's really nice to hear that you are trying to make it international in nature, which is really good. But yeah, it will be really, we would want to know more about the steps and how could the other countries, how could other countries be part of this? And you rightly said, the speakers rightly said that this G20 is not about one country, but it's about whole African Union, because AU is part of the G20 now. So how do we ensure that the AU, if African Union, is also part of this, apart from the other countries, especially from the global south? Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. So we're going to have Brenda and then Hilaire, and after that, Rion van der Merwe, you, Jorgensen, and then Katrin. I would ask everyone if you can please keep your question or proposal to 30 seconds or so, just that we can try give everyone a chance. Let's hear from Brenda, please.
Thank you, Tatenda, and good day or good morning, good afternoon to everyone on the call. So Tatenda, I think the questions that you have put on the screen, how do we reach consensus, and who have raised their hands and they're raising their hands for what? Let me ask the question. The form has been open, and I understand that it's going to be open up until January. Is Oxfam the convener in the interim to do one or two things? One, to consolidate the list that has been received thus far, so that we know who is who in the room, right? And what have respective organizations agreed to lead or do. Once we have a sense of all of that, I think then we can come to who is going to be the overall lead, which organization, because really it's about resources, capacity, and all of that. That's the first thing. The second thing that I really wanted to know, but maybe it will be informed by once Oxfam goes through the list, is that you have a social justice movement in this country that has mobilized many social justice NGOs and CBOs in the country? Have they been invited? And I'm saying this because I might not know that they have already responded to the form that you have. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. So we're just going to take I'm going to provide a few responses. I'll try to be as brief as possible. To the easy questions, the hard ones, I'm hoping my colleagues have answered in the text box. In terms of the deadline for the EOI, we initially did have a deadline, and we got feedback from civil society that they would want us to keep it open for a much longer time. So the EOI form is still open. Please do share it with all of your contacts, and encourage them to similarly share it. In terms of the working groups, no, they have not been decided. So I think as sort of convening organizations, Afrodad, Oxfam, Fighting Inequality and others, we have just been holding the space. So we have no mandate to say what the working groups need to be, how many they need to be, and all of that. I think the organizations that take the lead going forward will have to sort of facilitate that, which also links with Brenda's question of, is Oxfam convener of the forum? So currently Oxfam, Afrodad, and EJN have been hosting the forum from a tech side, but I think it's important to hear from everyone on this call. What do they want to happen next? Do they want Oxfam, Afrodad, and EJN to hand it over? If yes, who do we hand it over to, and all of that? So we really want to hear your suggestions on that. And then finally, Brenda, you asked if the social justice movement have been invited. So we have tried our best to invite, I think, all the organizations that we know of. We unfortunately don't know every single organization. So if you can, please share email addresses in the text box. We will be sure to sort of invite them into this process. All right, let's hear from Hilaire, and then Rion van der Merwe, and then you. Okay, I see Hilaire seem to have either dropped off or lowered their hand. So let's hear from Rion, and then you, and then Catherine Harvey, please. And if we can, please keep it to 30 seconds. Apologies about that.
Hi, Tatenda. No, all good. Just brief 2 points that I want to make. I was part of the Brazil C20 process under the philanthropy working group. I think I would really like to advocate for that one. If there is support, it's a very great working group for supporting financing that leaves no one behind, which we know in our region is very important. And I know there's a consortium of South African civil society and philanthropy groups that are working on that. I think some of them are here. And then my second point is regarding youth and youth inclusion. I think whatever the structure is, it's really important. Something I noted from the Brazil C20 process, there was a lack of youth representation within the leadership structure of the C20. And even though there is the Y20 for young people, that's a very group-specific space. I think there's need for an intersectional approach. So whatever this leadership structure is, there should be youth representation, youth-led organizations. Similarly, for the working groups, there should be organizations that can speak to the lived realities of youth as for other social groups, such as women or persons with disabilities. So just wanted to make those 2 quick points. Thank you, Tatenda.
Thanks so much, Rion. Let's hear from you. Jorgensen.
Yeah. Thanks, Tatenda. Good to see you all again, and thanks everyone for organizing this. So yeah, Hugh Jorgensen from Transparency International. We've been involved in G20 advocacy for, well, about 10 years now. So 2 quick questions though, and a little note. First one, just wondering if you have had any indication from the South African government on who the C20 representative will be, or how far advanced that process will be. And secondly, about contact points between the G20 and the C20. And I'm coming from an anti-corruption perspective, but this probably would have happened across other working groups this year in Brazil. our issue got subsumed into this broader working group, SDG 16, that had always been an anti-corruption working group in the C20 previously, and then that didn't happen this year. And that created a lot of confusion about who to address the G20 anti-corruption working group should be. And I think that was reflected in the fact that this year's G20 agenda had the weakest language, G20 communique had the weakest ever language on anti-corruption. I think the working groups should at least correspond to the official working groups. I think we should also be bold and not be afraid of having working groups that go beyond that. But at the very least, we should have working groups that there is an obvious corresponding point to the official G20 working groups. And lastly, just to say on timing, remembering that the G20 summit, of course, will happen in November, but a lot of the language will be decided far beyond then. So at least just in terms of timing and how the calendar works out, we should aim to have our recommendations done much earlier in the year, like around August, even at the latest. So it's my intervention.
Great. Thanks so much. Let's hear from Katrin Harvey and then Yolandi Hendler from HIC.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. Just 1 second to also go back to what Rion said about the Working Group 9 on Philanthropy and Sustainable Development. We at F20, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. F20 is a platform of foundations working specifically in the G20 space to advocate for climate and sustainability. So yes, also just to reiterate the usefulness of the Working Group 9 that we were part of the steering group, and that was led by WINGS, IIED, and GFED. To really continue on that work. And then secondly, on just tooting our own horn, F20 regularly organizes the Climate Solutions Forum, which is every year in the G20 presidency country and will be taking place on 27th and 28th of May in Cape Town. We are still consolidating on our partners. So this is very much an open invitation for anybody to reach out and get in touch to see how we can collaborate. I can also share some info about what we did in Rio, which was great and successful. So that could be one of the moments that Jenny mentioned in terms of the outside track, where we can consolidate our messaging, also use media and social media expertise to really push some of the messages. Also, what Hugh said early enough in the process to really have an influence on the decision-making processes. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katrin. Let's hear from Yolandi.
Thank you so much, Tatenda. My name is Yolanda Hendler. I'm the General Secretary at Habitat International Coalition. We're a global civil society coalition working to advance housing and land rights. And I just wanted to make 2 brief comments. The one is a suggestion around consensus building. I wonder whether it would be useful to just review what are the major groups and stakeholder groups at a United Nations level, as well as African Union, to ensure that the various topics and issues are being addressed. And one could also have a look at what are some of the major agencies globally that are working on particular issues. And obviously talking from a housing and land rights perspective, you will have noticed that there were only 5 organizations initially responding to this, and that is because we only sort of found out about this process quite recently, and there are a number. We have over 350 HIC member organizations worldwide, and I think with the change in UN Habitat's leadership and the leadership of the South African government in relation to global policy on informal settlements, it would be quite powerful to actually have a working group advancing housing and land. And my question in relationship to that is particularly how are working groups formed? What is the process around that? Thanks so much.
Thanks, Yolandi. So we have one more hand from Mohau Peko. And then after that, I think I would want us to sort of respond to Yolandi's final question about how are the working groups going to be selected. I don't have the answers. The hope is that I think all sort of 80 of us or all 70 of us on this call can come up with practical suggestions on how we go about that. So Mohau, let's hear from you, please.
Hi, my name is Mohau Peko. I am with SAWID, South African Women in Dialogue. The first thing I really want to say is that I want to caution, first of all, The big, with due respect to Oxfams, the Afrodads, etc. As I understand that you're holding the space now, but I think that it's really, really important to authenticate the secretariat or whoever is going to take this forward so that it is genuinely organizations that South Africa specific and Africa specific, with due respect. I also think that we can learn some very important lessons from the Africa Social Forum, the World Social Forum as well, in terms of how to organize. I think it was, I can't remember who it was, I think somebody from Transparency International. I think it's really, really critical that there is no disconnect between the working groups that the government set up. We need to link to that very carefully. I mean, there's the oceans stuff that is coming out. There's the township stuff, which the South African government has proposed. There's innovation and startups. We need to be able to link to all of those groupings realistically. And I think that we should try our best to mirror that within the C20, the various working groups, even though I know we haven't chosen them now. Yeah, let me pause there for now.
So, Mohau, I'm going to abuse my role as chair. I'm going to ask if you have perhaps suggestions on how we can authenticate the secretariat so that it's genuinely South African and African organizations. And then after your response, I would also ask you, Yolandi, what your suggestion is on how working groups, and I think the leadership can be sort of set up or agreed. So Mohau, I don't know if you have any thoughts. And I mean, we really want this to be a safe space, right? So please don't feel that your suggestion might, not be correct. Or I think that what we want is to hear all the ideas. And I think after this workshop and after tomorrow's workshop, we'll sort of jot down a one-pager, a summary of what came out for people to respond to further. So, I mean, what we decide, what we say today isn't the decision. I think we're just trying to sort of surface ideas. So, Mohau, do you have any ideas on how to authenticate the secretariat?
Yeah, I know that we have a weakness of localized domestic NGOs continentally. This is our weakness. And I see us using this particular platform now for a year to build up the strength of these localized organizations. They do exist. We have to sift them out and ensure that they participate effectively within whether it's a steering committee or whatever. What I'm trying to say is that while I respect the role that Oxfam and Afrodad and some of the bigger NGOs, which are actually global NGOs, I think that we need to prioritize, let me put it crudely, prioritize domestic local NGOs, both in South Africa and throughout the African continent, and give them the voice, I think, that they need to bring to the stage. This is not a possibility. We've done this with the World Social Forum. We're doing that now with the Africa Social Forum. So it's not a unique proposition that I'm coming up with, but I'm just saying that let us also use this opportunity to really strengthen the role of localized NGOs throughout the African continent.
Cool. I like that. The G20 really is a 12-month circus. And after sort of November 2025, I agree with you, Mohau, that we need to make sure that we as civil society are not worse off. We haven't been fighting, we haven't been decisive, but we need to make sure that by the end of next year, we're actually in a much stronger space, both in South Africa and on the continent. So I'm going to ask Yolandi if they have any suggestions. after which we have hands from Brenda and Tinashe, so they can speak after Yolandi.
Thank you. I think maybe if I can just briefly link to what Mohal said, I think that learning and linking with the organizers of the World Social Forum, which is taking place in Cotonou, Benin in West Africa in January 2026, actually one of our HIC social movement leaders is a key organizer there. I'd be happy to link and to bring them in. But I think it would also be very important to distinguish between NGOs and grassroots and social movement leaders. The ones fulfill this supporting organization and actually, and I think in terms of representation, and then I'll come to some suggestions for the working group, as it is done in many sort of regional and also cross-regional civic bodies that we are part of, that we could create very intentional representational criteria. So to say that we have the minimum number of social movement representatives, that we have a minimum gender balance criteria, et cetera, so that who is actually leading civil society or the C20 kind of leadership really then has that kind of authentic representational character. The working groups question is a big one. I need a bit of a time to think about that. What I can propose is again to connect with the movements and the leaders that are part of the World Social Forum and to understand a bit how they create working groups. I have heard the recommendation to align topics and issues with the priority issues that are being put forward by the South African government. I would need some time to come back with a sort of concrete and robust recommendation. But
cool.
I can link to the World Social Forum.
Sorry. No, look, I think what you said was very practical. If you get an email from us, from Aphrodite or Oxfam, asking for more time on these ideas, please do respond. And I think this is not just for Yolandi, it's for everyone in the call. I think this we had only 90 minutes. It's almost impossible to sort of surface all of these ideas. I think after these webinars, you will receive an email where we'll just ask for more input from everyone. So please feel free to do that. So I'm conscious of the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Brenda, Tinashe, and Marthy just to share their points. If they can, please keep it to the 30 seconds limit. That would be great. After that, I will unfortunately have to close up this call. We need to respect people's time. As I said in the opening, there is another webinar tomorrow. It's the exact same agenda, exact same content. So yeah, let's hear from Brenda and then Tinashe and then Marthy or Marty Mula.
Yeah, Tadenda, I indicated earlier, I think we're hamstrung by not knowing who has raised their hands at the moment, right? So and I'm going to ask, is it possible for us to have a second meeting? I mean, the year is almost over. Maybe in January, when Oxfam and Aphrodite, they have looked at who has responded on the form, right? And then look at a domestic African organization that can then be the secretariat. But also we need to be clear that we are not, we're looking for organizations that have been doing this work already that, can just come in and run and not be held back, but also have resources, right? So do we have to fundraise for the work of the secretariat? All those things must be considered. But I think we are hamstrung because we don't have the final list. So I'm requesting, is it possible that in the new year, just after the form is closed in January, that we have another call of 1 hour, so where the transparency that we talk about, we are transparent about who are the organizations that have lifted their hands and in which working groups they want to be in, and we'll pick up from that list an organization that we think can be the one that can serve as secretariat and lead us into the G20 summit in November. But the work starts in earnest in January, February. We don't have the time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Brenda. Tinashe, and then Marty.
Thank you so much, colleagues. I'm Tinashe from the National Council of and for Persons with Disabilities. Just to add my voice to, I think there was a speaker who said something about promoting domestic voices and promoting, empowering local grassroots CBOs to be also part of this. I'm just coming from the spirit of leaving no one behind. Have we thought about the inclusiveness of these convenings? I see even in this convening, we do not have either a South African Sign Language interpreter or an international sign language interpreter or captioning. Have you also thought about accessibility of outputs, the outputs that are going to come from the convenings, from the working groups? How to make sure that these outputs are accessible to other persons who might have challenges in accessing them at a high level. So I think that may also point us to maybe, do we need a coordinator who's going to coordinate in terms of inclusion and accessibility of convenings and outputs across the working groups and the major convenings? Thank you.
Thank you. Great points from everyone. Let's hear from Marty, and then we will wrap up.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say exactly that. I noticed that on the group we have National Child Rights Coalition, we have Disabled People South Africa, and I thought it would be an excellent idea to go for those social movement leaders and make sure that we have at least a women's group, a disability group, and a child rights coalition, so that all the organizations that fall under those are included. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marty. So I did see Lubabalo, who we met in Rio, is on the call. Lubabalo was, I think, part of the Disability 20 in Rio. So I do need to, I think, apologize that we haven't made that provision for sort of differently abled persons on this call. What we would request is, if anyone on this call perhaps
does have access to a sign interpreter and other similar resources, please do let us know. I think teamwork does make the dream work. So if you can, please let us know. Then next time we have a call, we will be sure to make provision for all persons. So in terms of next steps, as I said earlier, there's going to be a sort of duplicate webinar tomorrow. If you've attended today, chances are you might not learn anything new tomorrow. What we commit to do as Aphrodite, Oxfam, and EJN is to send an update email to everyone who will have attended today and tomorrow, as well as all the other people that are in our database that couldn't make it today. In that email, I think we will share the organizations that have signed up to say they want to be active within the C20 and the outsider role. So we will share that information. Also within that email, we will ask, I think, at least four questions. We will ask who wants to lead, so that it's clear and everyone is sort of on the same page. We will ask when we can meet next. There's been a suggestion for January. So I think we'll just provide a few options and then we will hear what the response is. And I think the third question, which is quite fundamental, is we'll ask, is everyone still comfortable for Aphrodite, Oxfam, and EJN to continue holding this space? So we're the ones that convened this workshop, and we are, I think, aware that our identities as sort of bigger organizations does have sort of associated strengths and weaknesses. So we would ask in that email if everyone is still fine for us to continue, for us to be the ones that initiate that next meeting. If the overwhelming majority is that we shouldn't be, then obviously we will respect that and hand it over to those organizations that put their hand up. So we're 5 minutes over time. I'm so sorry, because I know this time of year, there's like a million meetings, 30 reports that need to be done.
And for those in South Africa, some of the kids have already finished school, so we've got this extra burden. So apologies about taking up some of your time, but I think thank you so much for responding. Thank you so much for taking part. Thank you so much for that vibrant chat we've had, for the vibrant Q&A we've had. I know we haven't answered every question. I'm so sorry. I know it's specifically Aviwe, we haven't answered you. We will try to do that via email. But yeah, thanks everyone for the time, and we will be in touch via email and hopefully throughout 2025. Thanks so much.